The briefing room at Bagram Airfield fell silent when Major Derek Holly saw the name on the flight roster. Captain Nora Kine. Call sign, Ember. He'd heard the stories, read the after-action reports, seen the commendation that never quite translated into the respect she deserved. A woman who flew the A-10 Thunderbolt II like it was an extension of her own nervous system, who'd logged more combat hours over Afghanistan than half the squadron combined, and who still got assigned the milk runs, while hotshot lieutenants fresh from Tucson got the glory sorties. Holly's rubbed his temples. The mission was supposed to be straightforward. Close air support for a Special Forces team pinned down in the Korangal Valley, 8 clicks from the nearest fob, surrounded by Taliban fighters who turned a routine patrol into a potential massacre. But the weather was deteriorating. The enemy had shoulder-fired missiles, and the terrain was a nightmare of ridgelines and dead zones where radar went to die. He needed someone who wouldn't flinch when the sky turned hostile. Someone who understood that the A-10 wasn't built for elegance but for brutality, for taking punishment and delivering devastation in equal measure. His eyes drifted back to that name. Kine had been flying Warthogs since before most of his pilots knew how to spell CAS. She'd survived 2 tours in Iraq, pulled troops out of situations that should have been funeral processions, and never once demanded recognition for it. But she was also a woman in a community that still measured worth in handshake firmness and locker room bravado, and Hollies knew exactly how his ops officer would react to putting her on point for this mission. The door opened. Lieutenant Commander Price Walsh stepped inside, tablet in hand, already shaking his head before Hollies could speak. Walsh was old guard, Vietnam-era mentality wrapped in a modern uniform, the kind of officer who believed women belonged in transport planes and admin roles, not strapped into 7 tons of titanium and depleted uranium flying 30 feet above hostile ground. He saw Kine's name and his jaw tightened. Hollies watched the reaction, measured it against the mission parameters scrolling across his own screen. 8 American lives hanging in the balance. Enemy forces closing in, weather window shrinking by the minute. This wasn't the time for politics or prejudice. This was the time for competence. And whether Walsh liked it or not, Ember was the most competent pilot they had for exactly this kind of nightmare. Hollies closed the roster and looked Walsh dead in the eye, already knowing the argument that was coming, already knowing he'd override it. Because somewhere in the Korangal Valley, men were bleeding and praying for the sound of those twin turbofans, for the distinctive growl of the GAU-8 Avenger that meant salvation was inbound. And Hollies wasn't about to let outdated attitudes get good soldiers killed. Walsh dropped the tablet on the desk hard enough to make the pens rattle. His face had gone red, the kind of color that suggested high blood pressure and low tolerance for decisions that challenged his worldview. Hollies knew this dance. They'd done it before, every time Kine's name surfaced for anything beyond routine patrol or show-of-force flights that kept her visible but never truly utilized. Walsh believed in tradition, in the unspoken hierarchy that had governed military aviation since men first strapped wings to their backs and climbed toward the sun. He believed women could fly, sure, could handle trainers and maybe even fighters in controlled environments, but close air support in the Hindu Kush, with friendlies danger close and the enemy dug in like ticks. That required a certain kind of aggression, a willingness to push the aircraft past its limits and into the realm where skill blurred into instinct. Walsh didn't think women had that instinct. Hollies knew better. He'd seen Kine's gun camera footage from Fallujah, watched her walk 30mm rounds across an enemy position with surgical precision, while taking ground fire that would have sent lesser pilots scrambling for altitude. He'd read the debrief from the Helmand Province extraction, where she'd stayed on station for 40 minutes past bingo fuel, trading her own safety margin for the lives of Marines who didn't even know her name. The woman flew like she had something to prove, but not to anyone watching, to herself. That made her dangerous in the best possible way. The major leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. Outside the window, The flight line shimmered in the afternoon heat, A-10s parked in neat rows like sleeping predators waiting for the call to hunt. Walsh was still talking, running through the same tired arguments about upper body strength and G-tolerance and combat mentality, as if any of those factors mattered when you were flying an aircraft designed to absorb punishment rather than evade it. The A-10 didn't dance. It didn't need pilots who could pull 9GS in a sustained turn. It needed pilots who could stay calm when the cockpit filled with warning lights, who could nurse a crippled machine home on one engine and a prayer, who understood that their job wasn't to look good but to keep soldiers alive. Hollies cut Walsh off mid-sentence with a raised hand. The decision was made. Kine would fly lead. Walsh could file whatever protest he wanted, route it through whatever channels made him feel better, but the mission brief was going out in 20 minutes, and Ember's name would be at the top of the flight assignment. Walsh stood there, jaw working like he was chewing on words too bitter to swallow, then grabbed his tablet and left without saluting. Hollies didn't blame him for the anger. Change always felt like betrayal to people who'd built their identity on the old rules. He pulled up Kine's personnel file on his computer, scanning details he'd already memorized. Born in western Pennsylvania, coal country, the kind of place where the sky was perpetually gray and opportunities came with dust in your lungs. She joined the Air Force at 18, scored high enough on the aptitude tests to fly anything she wanted, and chose the Warthog specifically because it was the platform nobody else seemed to want. Too slow, too ugly, too specialized for modern warfare where stealth and speed dominated procurement budgets and strategic thinking. But Kine understood something the fighter jocks didn't. She understood that wars weren't won at 40,000 feet. They were won in the dirt, in the places where soldiers bled and died and needed someone willing to fly low enough to see their faces. Her training records were flawless. Her evaluation reports glowed with phrases like exceptional situational awareness and unparalleled weapons delivery accuracy. But her promotion velocity had been glacial, each rank achieved only after accumulating twice the flight hours of her male peers, as if competence needed to be proven again and again before it became undeniable. Hollies had served with enough women to know the pattern. The military preached equality but practiced skepticism, demanded perfection where it accepted adequacy from others, and then acted surprised when resentment festered in the gaps between policy and reality. The mission clock showed 16 minutes until brief. Holly stood, straightened his uniform, and walked toward the operations center where his pilots would be gathering, studying maps and weather reports and mentally preparing for the violence ahead. He could already picture their faces when he announced Kine as lead. Some would nod, knowing her record, respecting her skill even if they never said so publicly. Others would exchange glances, the kind of silent communication that conveyed doubt without requiring words. And Kine herself would stand there, expression neutral, absorbing the judgment like she'd absorbed it every day of her career, converting skepticism into fuel for the focus she'd need when the mission turned hot. Hollies had watched her in previous briefs. She never argued, never defended herself, never wasted energy on proving she belonged. She just flew. And when she came back, when the troops she'd covered were safe and the enemy positions were smoking craters, she filed her reports with the same quiet efficiency and prepared for the next sortie. Recognition didn't seem to matter to her. Results did. That was the mark of a true professional, someone who transcended the need for external validation and found purpose in the work itself. The operations center was already half full when Hollies entered. Pilots in flight suits clustered around the mission board, pointing at topographical features and discussing approach vectors. The room smelled like jet fuel and coffee, the distinctive mix that defined every military airfield Hollies had ever worked. He spotted Kine in the back corner, alone as usual, reviewing a tablet that displayed the same tactical data everyone else was seeing, but somehow seeing it differently, processing it through a lens shaped by experience and survival. She was 36, older than most captains, her promotion timeline extended by factors that had nothing to do with her flying, and everything to do with politics she refused to play. Her hair was regulation length, pulled into a tight bun that made her face look severe in the fluorescent light. She had scars on her hands from an ejection in a rock that had gone sideways, injuries she'd never used as an excuse to ground herself or request easier assignments. Hollis respected that. The military was full of people who collected injuries like merit badges, wearing their trauma as proof of sacrifice. Kine wore hers like they were simply part of the job description. He called the room to attention, and the chatter died instantly, pilots snapping upright with the discipline that came from years of conditioning. Hollis didn't waste time with pleasantries. The situation in the Quarangle was deteriorating by the minute. A 12-man Special Forces team designated Anvil 6 had been compromised during a village-clearing operation, ambushed by a force estimated at 60-plus Taliban fighters with prepared positions and heavy weapons. The team had managed to reach a defensive position on a ridgeline but was effectively surrounded, taking casualties, running low on ammunition. Fast movers had already made gun runs, but the terrain limited their effectiveness. Too many friendlies mixed with hostiles, too much risk of fratricide. This was A-10 work. Low, slow, ugly work that required eyes on target and the kind of precision that only came from pilots who understood the difference between close air support and danger close. Hollis pulled up the map on the main display, red icons marking enemy positions, blue showing Anvil 6's location. The valley was a kill box, steep walls on 3 sides, only one viable approach vector, and whether moving in from the west that would close the window completely in 90 minutes. He turned to face the room, let his gaze sweep across each pilot before landing on Kine. Her expression hadn't changed, but he saw something flicker in her eyes, the recognition that this was her mission, that everything she trained for and survived had led to this moment. Hollis announced the flight assignments. Kine would fly lead as Ember 1. Lieutenant Marcus Webb would fly her wing as Ember 2. Webb was solid, a third-generation pilot who'd grown up around aviation and had the natural aptitude that came from breathing jet fuel since childhood. He was also smart enough to recognize talent when he saw it, which meant he wouldn't bristle at flying under Kine's command. Some of the other pilots shifted in their seats, the subtle movements of men processing information they hadn't expected. Kine remained motionless. Hollis continued with the brief, walking through approach altitudes, comm frequencies, target priorities, emergency procedures. The enemy had at least 2 confirmed Zu-23 positions, Soviet-era anti-aircraft guns that could shred an A-10 if the pilot got predictable. There were also reports of man-portable air defense systems, MANPADS in military speak, shoulder-fired missiles that had been the death of more than one close air support bird. The A-10 was built to take punishment, its titanium bathtub protecting the pilot from ground fire up to 23 millimeters, but even the Warthog had limits. Kine stepped forward when Hollis opened the floor for questions, her voice steady and clear in the acoustically dead room. She wanted to know the exact position of Anvil 6 relative to the tree line, whether the team had smoke for marking, what color. She asked about wind speed at ridge level, about civilian presence in the village below, about rules of engagement if enemy fighters retreated into structures. These were the questions of someone who'd done this before, who understood that the difference between mission success and catastrophe often came down to details nobody else thought to ask. Hollis answered each one, pulling data from the intelligence brief, checking with the tactical operations controller who was monitoring the situation in real time. Anvil 6 had purple smoke. Wind was gusting to 15 knots from the northwest. No confirmed civilians in the immediate engagement area. Row was weapons-free on any military-age male carrying a weapon within 200 meters of the friendly position. Kine nodded once, filing the information away in whatever mental map she'd constructed of the battlefield she hadn't yet seen. Other pilots asked their questions, routine stuff about fuel states and recovery bases, and what to do if the weather closed completely. Then Hollies dismissed them to pre-flight. The flight line was organized chaos, crew chiefs swarming over aircraft, loading technicians pushing carts of 30mm ammunition toward the A-10s that would carry it into battle. Each Warthog held 1,100 rounds of depleted uranium slugs, the kind of projectile that could punch through tank armor and turn engine blocks into modern art. The GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon was the reason the aircraft existed, everything else just supporting structure to get that gun to the fight and keep it there long enough to do the job. Kine walked toward her assigned bird, tail number 800247, an airframe that had been flying combat missions since the first Gulf War. The paint was faded, the titanium belly scarred from decades of flying low enough to taste the dirt. She ran her hand along the fuselage as she did her walk around, checking control surfaces and hydraulic lines, with the thoroughness of someone who knew that pre-flight wasn't about ceremony but survival. Her crew chief, Senior Airman Rodriguez, met her at the boarding ladder with a smile. Rodriguez had been working Kine's aircraft for 8 months and had learned to trust her in ways that transcended rank and regulation. She didn't showboat, didn't push the machine harder than necessary, and always brought it home even when home seemed like an impossibility. Rodriguez handed her the maintenance logbook, pointing out a minor hydraulic leak they'd fixed that morning, assuring her the bird was ready to fight. Kine reviewed the entries, signed off on the repairs, and climbed into the cockpit with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd made this climb thousands of times. The seat molded to her body, the stick felt right in her hand, the throttles responded with the familiar resistance that told her the engines were ready. She began the startup sequence, each switch and check performed from muscle memory while her mind was already in the valley, visualizing the terrain, calculating approach angles, considering what she'd do when the plan inevitably fell apart. Flying wasn't about perfect execution. It was about adaptation, about making new decisions faster than the environment could change. She'd learned that in Iraq when her flight lead had taken a SAM, and she'd been left alone over Ramadi with friendly troops in contact, and no backup for 20 minutes. She'd learned it again in Afghanistan when hydraulic failure had forced her to land a crippled A-10 at a forward operating base with a runway barely long enough for a Cessna. Each crisis had stripped away another layer of doubt, revealed another reservoir of capability she hadn't known existed. The engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, twin General Electric turbofans that produced 9,000 pounds of thrust and could run on damn near anything that burned. The A-10 wasn't elegant. It was functional, designed by engineers who understood that the perfect weapon wasn't the one that looked good in promotional footage, but the one that kept working when everything else failed. Kine completed her checks, contacted ground control, and began taxiing toward the runway where Webb was already holding short in Ember 2. The tower cleared them for immediate departure, priority handling because men were dying and every minute counted. Kine acknowledged, lined up on centerline and pushed the throttles forward. The acceleration was sluggish compared to fighters, the A-10 built for endurance rather than speed, but the power was there, reliable and steady. She rotated at 120 knots, felt the wheels leave concrete, and climbed into the crystalline blue of the Afghan sky. Below, Bagram shrank to insignificance, the sprawling base becoming just another collection of buildings in a landscape that had been consuming empires since before America was a concept. Webb formed up on her right wing, his voice crackling over the radio with the brevity code that meant he was ready, that whatever happened next they'd face it together. The flight to the Korangal Valley took 18 minutes at cruise speed, the landscape unrolling beneath them in shades of brown and gray, mountains that looked deceptively peaceful from altitude. Kine monitored the tactical frequency, listening to Anvil 6's radio calls growing more desperate. The team leader, a captain with the call sign Ironside, was trying to maintain calm in his voice, but the strain was audible. They'd taken 3 wounded, were down to 20% ammunition, had lost their satellite uplink when a mortar round destroyed their communications rig. The enemy was massing for a final assault, probing the perimeter, testing the team's ability to respond. Ironside needed air support and he needed it 5 minutes ago. Kine checked her position, calculated time to target, and keyed the mic. Her voice was steady, almost conversational, the tone of someone announcing dinner plans rather than flying into a kill box. She told Ironside that Ember flight was 8 minutes out, told him to pop smoke on her command, told him to keep his people's heads down because she was coming in low and the gun runs would be danger close. Ironside's response was thick with relief, the kind of emotion that came from staring at death and seeing reprieve arrive on twin turbofans. Webb called out the geographic checkpoint that marked the valley entrance, a distinctive rock formation the local pilots had nicknamed the Fang for its resemblance to a broken tooth jutting from the ridgeline. Kine acknowledged and began her descent, dropping from 12,000 feet to 4,000 in a controlled dive that would have made passenger aircraft occupants vomit, but felt perfectly natural in the Warthog. The terrain rose to meet them, details emerging from the general brown, individual trees and buildings, and the snake-like path of the river that had carved this valley over millennia. She could see the village now, mud brick structures clustered on the valley floor, and higher up on the eastern ridge, the defensive position where Anvil 6 was fighting for their lives. Muzzle flashes sparkled in the shadows, small arms fire that looked almost decorative from altitude but was tearing through flesh and bone on the ground. Kine armed her weapons systems, the mechanical clicks and electronic tones confirming that the GAU-8 was ready, that the Maverick missiles hanging under her wings were ready, that every system designed to deliver violence was functioning exactly as intended. This was the moment where theory became practice, where all the training and all the preparation either proved sufficient or revealed its gaps. She called for Anvil 6 to mark their position and watched purple smoke bloom on the ridgeline, a vivid stain against the earth tones of the mountainside. The smoke drifted northwest, confirming the wind data from the brief, giving her the information she needed to compensate for drift when she fired. Enemy positions were visible now, fighters moving between rocks and trees, trying to close the distance to the American position before the aircraft could engage. Kine selected the GAU-8, adjusted her dive angle, and lined up the first gun run with the precision of a surgeon making an incision. The heads-up display showed range decreasing, the targeting pipper moving across the terrain as she flew, her thumb resting on the trigger waiting for the moment when geometry and velocity aligned perfectly. Webb was offset to her left, ready to follow her run, ready to add his firepower to the equation. Kine's breathing slowed, her heart rate dropping into the zone where time seemed to stretch, and every detail became hyperreal. She could see individual fighters now, could see the weapons they carried, could see the exact moment when they realized the A-10 was committed to the attack and started scrambling for cover. The trigger pressed, and the aircraft shuddered as the GAU-8 came alive. 65 rounds per second of depleted uranium screaming downrange at 3,700 feet per second. The sound was distinctive, a mechanical roar that soldiers on the ground described as a sound between a burp and a growl, the most beautiful noise in the world if it was on your side, and the last thing you heard if it wasn't. Kine walked the rounds across the enemy position, watching through the targeting pod as human shapes disappeared in eruptions of dirt and rock. The gun camera recorded everything in clinical detail, footage that would later be reviewed and analyzed and filed away as evidence of precision and proportionality. But in the moment, there was no analysis, only action and consequence. She pulled out of the dive at 800 feet, feeling the G-forces compress her body into the seat, and climbed back to relative safety while Webb rolled in for his run. His accuracy was good, complementing her attack, ensuring that the enemy position she'd hit stayed suppressed. Ironside's voice came over the radio, calm now, professional, calling out additional targets that had revealed themselves by firing at the aircraft. Kine acknowledged, already maneuvering for the second run. The enemy ZU-23 opened up from a concealed position near the tree line, green tracers arcing toward the sky in streams that looked deceptively slow, until you remembered they were traveling at 3,000 feet per second. Kine broke right, dispensing flares as a precaution even though the gun wasn't radar-guided, old habits from Iraq, where threat density made paranoia a survival trait. The tracers missed, passing through the space where she would have been if she'd maintained her flight path, and she made a mental note of the gun's location for her next pass. The A-10 could absorb 23mm fire, but absorbing it and ignoring it were different things. The aircraft had redundant systems, dual engines, manual reversion capability, all the engineering that went into making a survivable close air support platform. But survivable didn't mean invulnerable. Enough hits in the wrong places, and even the Warthog would fall from the sky. She called out the ZU-23's position to Webb, told him she'd suppress it with a Maverick so he could focus on the infantry positions that were still threatening Anvil 6. Webb acknowledged, and Kine selected one of the AGM-65 missiles, waited for the seeker head to lock onto the heat signature of the anti-aircraft gun, and fired. The Maverick dropped from the wing pylon and ignited, accelerating to Mach .8 as it guided itself toward the target with the single-minded determination of a weapon system that didn't care about survival, only completion. Kine watched the impact through her targeting pod, the explosion consuming the gun position and the crew that had been serving it, removing the biggest threat to her aircraft and restoring freedom of maneuver. Webb was already rolling in, his gun singing that distinctive song, his rounds chewing through enemy fighters who thought they could rush the American position while the aircraft were repositioning. The mathematics of close air support were brutal and simple. Every enemy fighter killed was one less threat to the friendlies. Every second the aircraft stayed on station was another second the trapped team survived. Kine had long ago made peace with the moral calculus of her profession. She wasn't here to judge or to question the geopolitical decisions that had put American soldiers in this valley. She was here to keep them alive. Everything else was above her pay grade and outside her concern. The third gun run was textbook, her rounds impacting exactly where she'd intended, the enemy position evaporating in a cloud of dust and supersonic metal. Ironside reported enemy fighters breaking contact, retreating north towards secondary positions in the rocks above the village. The immediate pressure on Anvil 6 was relieved, but the team was still pinned, still unable to move without risking exposure to snipers and residual forces that hadn't joined the retreat. Kine checked her fuel state, calculated how much longer she could stay on station, and decided they had time for one more orbit before they'd need to tank or return to base. She told Ironside they'd maintain overhead cover until the extraction birds arrived, that nobody was leaving until the whole team was safe. The gratitude in his response was unprofessional and heartfelt, the kind of emotion that broke through military bearing, because some moments were too raw for formality. Kine didn't acknowledge it directly, just confirmed she understood his situation and would remain available for fire support if needed. Webb had moved into a lazy circle above the valley, watching for threats, scanning the terrain with the practiced eye of someone who knew that complacency killed more pilots than enemy action. They flew in silence for several minutes, the only sound the engine hum and the occasional radio check from tactical operations confirming they were still mission effective. The extraction helicopters appeared on Kine's radar scope 20 minutes later, two CH-47 Chinooks escorted by a pair of Apache gunships, the cavalry arriving to pull Anvil 6 out of the nightmare they'd been trapped in for 6 hours. Kine coordinated with the helicopter flight lead, briefing him on the tactical situation, marking the areas that were still hot, ensuring the extraction could proceed without flying into an ambush. The Chinooks made their approach low and fast, flaring hard at the landing zone while the Apache orbited overhead with their chain guns ready. Anvil 6 loaded in organized chaos, wounded first, equipment second, every man checking that his buddy made it aboard before climbing in himself. Kine watched through her targeting pod, counting personnel, ensuring nobody got left behind. 12 men went into that valley. 12 men were going to come out. The math was simple, but the achievement was anything but. The helicopters lifted off in a cloud of rotor wash and dust, climbing hard to get above the effective range of small arms, and Kine followed them out of the valley, providing overwatch until they cleared the ridgeline and entered friendly airspace. The flight back to Bagram was quiet, the post-mission clarity settling over her like a familiar weight. She'd fired 900 rounds of 30mm ammunition and 1 Maverick missile. She'd achieved all mission objectives with 0 friendly casualties and no damage to her aircraft. The metrics were clean, professional, the kind of numbers that looked good in after-action reports. But Kine knew the real measure wasn't in the numbers. It was in the 12 men who'd board a transport plane tonight and fly home to families who'd never know how close they'd come to getting folded flags instead of homecoming hugs. That was the job. Not glory, not recognition, just results. She landed at Bagram as the sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, the sky turning that particular shade of orange that made Afghanistan beautiful when you forgot about everything that made it terrible. Rodriguez met her on the flight line with a bottle of water and a smile, asked how the bird performed. Kine told her it flew perfectly, no issues, ready for the next sortie whenever they needed it. The formality of the conversation masked the understanding beneath it, the recognition that they were both part of a machine that worked because individuals did their jobs without seeking credit. The debrief lasted an hour, Kine walking through every phase of the mission, while intelligence officers took notes and ops planners asked questions about enemy tactics and weapon effectiveness. Major Holly sat in the back of the room, observing, saying nothing until the formal portion concluded and the other officers filtered out. Then he approached her, his expression unreadable in the fluorescent light. He told her the mission was executed flawlessly, that Anvil 6's team leader had already submitted a written commendation, that the gun camera footage was being used as a training example for proper employment of danger-close fires. Kine nodded, accepting the praise with the same neutrality she'd accepted criticism in the past, understanding that both were just noise around the central fact of whether the mission succeeded. Holly studied her for a moment, and she saw something shift in his expression, a reassessment happening in real time. He'd known her record, but knowing and witnessing were different things. Now he'd witnessed. He told her to get some rest, that she was back on the flight schedule tomorrow, and walked out before she could respond. Kine stood alone in the debriefing room, listening to the distant sound of aircraft engines, feeling the familiar exhaustion that came from sustained adrenaline finally releasing its grip. Sleep came hard that night, her mind replaying the mission in fragments, analyzing decisions, considering alternatives, running through the endless what-ifs that haunted every pilot who'd been in combat. She thought about the enemy fighters she'd killed, wondered if they'd had families, if they'd believed in their cause, or were just following orders like soldiers everywhere. Then she pushed the thoughts away because that path led nowhere useful. War was a blunt instrument applied to complex problems, and she was just one small part of a mechanism too large and too distant for her to influence. Her job was to fly, to support the troops on the ground, to be the difference between mission success and catastrophe. Everything else was philosophy, and philosophy didn't help when the bullets were flying. She finally drifted off around 0300, dreams full of purple smoke and the mechanical roar of the GAU-8, the sounds that defined her professional existence. Morning came too early, as it always did, the alarm dragging her from sleep that hadn't been restful enough. She dressed in her flight suit, drank coffee that tasted like burned dirt, and walked toward the operations center where another mission brief was already underway. The squadron's attitude had shifted in subtle ways she couldn't quite articulate but definitely felt. Pilots who'd previously kept their distance now nodded when she entered the room. Webb sought her out specifically to discuss tactics from yesterday's mission, asking questions that suggested genuine interest rather than polite obligation. Even Walsh, the operations officer who'd argued against her flying lead, maintained a careful neutrality that felt like grudging respect delivered through silence. Kine didn't comment on the change, didn't acknowledge it in any way, just continued operating as she always had. But she noticed, and she understood what it meant. Competence in the abstract was always subject to debate, colored by prejudice and assumption. Competence demonstrated was harder to dismiss. She'd proven something yesterday, not to herself but to the people who needed convincing, and in proving it she'd shifted the baseline of what was considered possible. The next female pilot who flew Warthogs would have a slightly easier path because Kine had flown hers well. That was the nature of progress in institutions resistant to change. Not revolutionary transformation, but incremental adjustment, each success creating space for the next person. The week that followed brought more missions, more gun runs, more hours logged in the distinctive cockpit of the A-10. Kine flew close air support for Army units conducting village clearances, suppressed enemy positions threatening convoy routes, provided overwatch for Special Forces teams operating in contested areas. Each mission added to her total. Each successful engagement reinforced her reputation. Each safe landing was another data point in the argument she'd been making through action rather than words. She noticed the mission assignments changing, the milk runs disappearing from her schedule, replaced by the complex, high-stakes sorties that required judgment and skill in equal measure. Holly's was testing her, she realized, or maybe just using her properly, putting his best asset where it could do the most good. Either way, she flew what they gave her and brought the aircraft home, maintained the standard she'd set for herself long before anyone else was paying attention. The squadron began to coalesce around a new normal, one where her presence wasn't an anomaly requiring explanation, but simply part of how they operated. But normalcy in a war zone was always temporary, always subject to the chaos that defined combat operations. The call came on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the Korangal mission, when Kine was reviewing maintenance reports and planning for a routine patrol scheduled for that afternoon. The Tactical Operations Center needed immediate air support for a medical evacuation under fire, a medevac bird taking heavy contact while trying to extract casualties from a firefight near the Pakistani border. The helicopter had managed to land but couldn't take off. Enemy fire too intense, the pilot refusing to abort the mission while wounded soldiers were still loading. They needed someone to suppress the enemy positions, to buy the helicopter enough time to get airborne and clear the kill zone. It was the kind of mission that separated pilots who flew for career advancement from pilots who flew because soldiers needed them. Kine was airborne in 12 minutes, Webb on her wing, both aircraft loaded for close air support with full ammunition drums and a mixed load of rockets and missiles. The flight time was minimal, the border area only 30 clicks from Bagram, close enough that she could see the smoke rising from the engagement area while still climbing to altitude. The scene that greeted them was worse than the initial report suggested. The medevac helicopter, a U-60 Black Hawk marked with red crosses, was on the ground in a dried riverbed, rotors still turning, crew chiefs trying to load wounded while taking fire from 3 directions. The original patrol that had called for the evacuation was pinned down 100 meters away, unable to provide effective covering fire because they were too busy surviving their own contact.